All right, so you wanted to hear about this so-called Russian anti-gay law, right?
And it's been all over the news.
It's been making headlines.
Yeah.
And some of it does sound kind of scary, I got to say.
Right.
But today, we're going beyond those headlines.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to look at this 2014 white paper that digs deep into what this law actually says.
It's a really
This
interesting.
is being applied and what it really tells us about.
It really goes into the legal stuff, you know?
LGBT rights in Russia.
Especially maybe coverage. It compares
compared to the U.S.
the situation in Russia to the U.S. So it's
So to start, let's just address this head on. The official title of this law is Federal Law Number 135 FZ of the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors.
Oh, okay.
That phrase "among minors" is really key.
Right. It's not.
This isn't about it's criminalizing homosexuality. It's about disseminating information.
Disseminating information, right?
To young people, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of interesting because right away it raises all these questions about, well, what is propaganda and who gets to decide what's harmful to minors? And those are the sorts of questions that that this paper goes into.
So let's get into the specifics of the law.
Okay.
The white paper breaks down the penalties for violating this law.
Okay.
We're talking fines for individuals, officials, organizations that distribute information that's deemed harmful to children.
Right.
And even heftier fines for distributing anything about non-traditional sexual relations.
Yeah, and it's not just fines, right? The law talks about much harsher penalties for using media or the internet to spread this information.
Right.
And if you're not a citizen, you could be expelled from Russia.
Oh, wow.
It's the white paper really lays out the severity of the consequences.
Sounds pretty intense. But here's the thing.
Okay.
The white paper points out that for 7 years before this federal law was enacted, similar bans on propaganda existed in 10 different regions in Russia.
It's interesting.
And get this.
Yeah.
There were only 6 prosecutions and 2 convictions during that whole period.
Wow.
And both of those convictions were overturned on appeal.
That's really interesting. That suggests that the enforcement has been, at least historically, pretty limited, even in places with more visible LGBT communities.
Right.
Like, for example, you had Nikolai Bayev and Irina Fedotova.
Yeah.
They were convicted for just holding up a sign outside of a school that said homosexuality is normal.
Right.
They were acquitted, ultimately. But it really illustrates the kind of like arbitrary nature of enforcement.
Right. So we have this law with these potentially really harsh penalties.
Right.
But historically, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement at the regional level.
So what happens when we look at the federal law?
Has it actually been the crackdown that some media outlets suggest?
Right.
The white paper talks about Dmitry Azikov, the first person charged under this law.
What did he do?
He was holding a sign that read, "Being gay and loving gays is normal. Beating guys and killing gays is a crime."
Oh, okay.
But the complaint was filed against him by a teenager whose father reportedly hates gay people and made his son file the complaint.
Oh, so it's a
complicated case.
Very layered situation.
Yeah. It does raise some concerns about how this law could be misused.
Yeah.
But it's important to note that the widespread arrests and persecution that some people were worried about haven't happened.
It's much more nuanced than that, it seems.
So we've established that this law exists. It's got some teeth. But the enforcement hasn't been as widespread as some people thought.
So how does that compare to
the U.S.?
LGBT rights in Russia?
Right. How do they compare?
Versus the U.S. The white paper actually goes into this comparison, and I think you might be surprised
I'm sure.
by what it finds.
All right, let's hear it.
Well, for starters, homosexuality was decriminalized in Russia back in 1993.
Okay.
Believe it or not, it's still criminalized in 12 U.S. states. Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, so maybe this idea that Russia is somehow behind the U.S. in terms of LGBT rights needs a little bit of a rethink.
Yeah, what else?
So it turns out that employment discrimination based on sexual orientation is actually legal in Russia.
Interesting.
But it's still legal in many U.S. states.
Okay.
And when it comes to military service, openly gay individuals can serve in Russia. But the U.S. had don't ask, don't tell until just a few years ago.
Yeah, 2011.
2011, that's a pretty big difference.
It is.
Are there any other areas where Russia seems to be ahead of the U.S. in terms of LGBT rights?
Well, men who have sex with men can actually donate blood in Russia, but they're banned from doing so in the U.S.
Wow.
And single gay people can adopt in both countries, but joint adoption by same-sex couples faces more restrictions in Russia.
Yeah.
And statistically, you're much more likely to be the victim of an anti-LGBT hate crime in the U.S. than in Russia.
Wow.
That's according to data from both the FBI and the SOVA Center in Russia.
That's not what I was expecting at all.
It's a really interesting comparison.
It really challenges our assumptions about LGBT rights in these two countries.
Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge that Russia has a lot of issues
Of course.
with LGBT equality,
Yeah.
but it's not so simple as
Right.
some people make it out to be.
That's a really important point, but it kind of makes you wonder if the law isn't being widely enforced.
Right.
If the reality for LGBT people in Russia isn't as bleak as some people make it seem, why is there so much hype around this law in the media?
Could there be more to this story?
The white paper looks at that question and suggests that maybe the media's focus is being influenced by more than just a concern for LGBT rights. It even quotes a Russian State Duma deputy, Alexei Mitrofanov.
Okay.
He said, "This law, frankly speaking, is more addressed to show business. Earning millions of dollars here, they are turning their concerts into rallies that are attended by children over 12 years of age."
Oh, so he's saying the law's more about
So is he implying that
controlling the messages spread by
it's about controlling the message? Yeah, especially to younger audiences.
farmers, yeah.
Makes you wonder, could the media's outrage be partly driven by the potential economic impact of this law on big U.S. entertainment companies?
Yeah, I mean, think about it.
The white paper talks about how Russia's entertainment and media market is booming.
Russia's a huge market for global entertainment.
International revenue makes up a whopping 70% of Hollywood studios' income. Wow. And Russia's box office has seen a 15-fold increase since 2001.
So it's a major...
It's becoming a major player
Right.
in the global
Yes.
entertainment landscape.
Yeah.
And the white paper even quotes Andy Bird, chairman of Walt Disney International.
Okay.
He said, "Russia has become a top 5 market for us. And for some movies, it's even more important than that."
So Russia is a gold mine
So yeah,
for Hollywood.
Russia's a gold mine for Hollywood, and this law could really disrupt that.
And that's going to be a huge incentive for U.S. companies to push back.
Makes you wonder if the media's focus on the anti-gay aspects of the law might actually be overshadowing these economic considerations. Could it be that the outrage is being, amplified to protect U.S. business interests?
That's an interesting question.
It's something to think about, right?
Yeah,
It's not to say that concerns for LGBT rights aren't valid,
of course.
but there might be more layers to this story.
Right. There might be other things going on.
It's a really complicated situation, and we've only just scratched the surface here.
I can't wait to dig in more.
We'll be back in a minute to go even deeper into the potential consequences of this law for U.S. businesses and unpack the real story behind this really controversial law.
Yeah, it really does make you think.
Yeah, there's so much more to this story than what we usually hear about
Right.
while we're talking about consequences.
Yeah.
The white paper brings up a really interesting part of the law, the penalties for non-citizens.
Right. It's not just about fines either.
Yeah.
If you're a non-citizen and you're found guilty of spreading this so-called propaganda,
All right.
you could actually get kicked out of Russia.
Wow.
That's a big deal.
Pretty strong message.
Yeah.
Almost like the law is sending a message not just to individuals, but to other countries, maybe.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It seems like they're really worried about controlling what people think about LGBT issues,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to young people.
Yeah.
And focusing on non-citizens, yeah, that could definitely be a way of trying to control things outside of Russia, too.
So if it's about controlling the message, why single out foreign companies, especially those from the U.S.?
Well, you got to think about it.
Yeah.
Russia is a huge market for global entertainment.
Right.
And this law could be a way for the government to try and have some say over what foreign companies do there.
Okay.
It's kind of like they're saying, if you want to do business here, you have to play by our rules.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And given how big and influential the U.S. entertainment industry is,
Oh, yeah.
it's not surprising that Russia might want to have some control over what they're doing there. But here's a thought. Could this whole anti-gay thing that we've been hearing in the media actually be helping Russia?
Whoa. That's
Yeah.
a really interesting question. And it's something that the white paper actually wants us to think about
Yeah.
by just focusing on LGBT rights. we might be missing the bigger picture.
Hmm.
There might be other things going on, like political or economic stuff that's affecting the situation.
So what's the big takeaway here? What do we really need to understand about this law?
Well, I think the most important thing is that Russia is a lot more complicated than how people make it seem.
Right.
The law does raise some concerns,
Of course.
but it's not a simple case of good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
There's a lot going on. Culture, politics, the economy. We can't ignore that stuff.
And the U.S. isn't perfect either when it comes to LGBT rights.
No, not at all.
The white paper does a good job of pointing out where the U.S. still needs to improve.
Yeah, things like discrimination in the workplace or hate crimes.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that LGBT rights is a global fight.
Right. It's not just something happening over there.
Exactly.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
So stepping back from all the headlines and looking at the bigger picture,
Okay.
what can we learn from this? What does it mean for LGBT rights going forward, both in Russia and around the world?
I think the biggest thing is realizing how much the media shapes what we think about the world. The white paper shows how easy it is for people to twist information to fit their own agenda.
Whether it's about politics, the economy, or something else entirely.
Right, exactly.
So we have to think critically.
Yeah.
We can't just believe everything we hear.
Right.
We have to question our own assumptions and look for different perspectives.
And that's especially important now with information spreading so fast all over the place.
Right. We're constantly bombarded with news and opinions.
It can be hard to know what to believe.
So how can we apply this critical thinking to LGBT rights?
Okay, well, one big question to ask is, who benefits from this particular story?
Right.
Is it really just about human rights? Or is something else going on? We also need to think about where we're getting our information from. Are they reliable? Are they biased?
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember that this fight for LGBT rights is a worldwide thing.
Yeah,
We need to support the people who are fighting for change in places like Russia.
absolutely.
But we also have to be careful not to spread harmful stereotypes or oversimplify things.
That's a good point.
You know, it's interesting to think about that comparison the white paper makes between LGBT rights in Russia and the U.S.
Yeah.
There are actually some surprising similarities.
Like what?
For example, both countries let single gay people adopt,
Right.
but it's harder for same-sex couples to adopt together in both places.
That's true. And even though same-sex marriage is legal everywhere in the U.S. now,
Yeah.
there are still people trying to challenge those rights at the state level.
So even though Russia and the U.S. are very different politically and socially, they both seem to be struggling with the same question. Should same-sex relationships have the same legal recognition as other relationships?
That's a really good observation.
Yeah.
And it shows that the fight for LGBT equality is something that people are dealing with all over the world.
So no matter where we live, we all have a part to play in this.
That's right.
That brings us back to how we can best support the people fighting for change, both in the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah.
The white paper doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but
Yeah.
it gives us a lot to think about.
It really does.
It's interesting. The white paper doesn't give us easy answers.
No.
Instead, it wants us to think about this really complex issue in a deeper way.
Yeah, it really challenges us.
And that's what we're all about on the Deep Dive, right?
Absolutely.
We want you to have the information and context you need so that you can make up your own mind and be part of these important conversations.
It's about empowering people to think for themselves.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Okay, shoot.
The white paper brings up the idea that the media's focus on this Russian law might actually be driven by economic factors.
Oh, interesting.
It suggests there might be a connection between the U.S. government's stance on the law
Right?
and the potential impact on big U.S. companies.
So it makes you wonder, does money have too much influence on how we think about human rights?
Yeah, how can we make sure that profits don't come at the expense of basic freedoms?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, those are hard questions with no easy answers.
No easy answers at all.
But they're questions we all need to think about as the world becomes more interconnected.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners, keep exploring this issue.
Yeah, keep digging.
Keep questioning your assumptions.
Don't take things at face value.
Because if you care about human rights and want to see real change in the world,
Yeah.
you need to understand what's really going on here.
It's all about making the world a better place.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for being here with us on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure.
It's been amazing to unpack this complex issue and look at all the different sides of the story.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion.
We hope this has given you some new insights and that you'll keep thinking critically about this issue.
Keep learning, keep questioning.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep diving deeper. Thinking about all this, I keep going back to that quote from the white paper from that Russian State Duma deputy, Alexei Mitrofanov.
Oh, yeah.
He clearly sees this law as a way to protect, like, Russian values and what he thinks of as traditional family structures.
Right, and that's important to remember.
Yeah.
It's easy to say this law is just homophobic, but you have to understand the culture.
Right.
Russia's history is different from the U.S.
Yeah.
They have a different social fabric, and their view on LGBT rights comes from those differences.
The white paper talks about that, right?
Exactly.
It looks at how Russia's history, including the influence of the Orthodox Church, has shaped how things are today.
Right. It shows us that we need to be aware of cultural differences when we talk about LGBT rights.
Yeah.
Just trying to force Western values on other countries might not be the best way to make things better.
Makes you think about how different strategies might be needed for different cultures.
Absolutely.
What works in one country might not work in another.
The white paper really makes us think about how we approach these issues globally. It's not about forcing everyone to do the same thing. It's about understanding the challenges and opportunities that are unique to each society.
So instead of condemning the Russian law outright, maybe we should be asking how to best promote LGBT rights in a place like Russia, where culture and history are so important.
Exactly. It's about having conversations, understanding different viewpoints, and finding common ground.
Right. It's a lot more complicated than just imposing sanctions or condemning them.
It is.
And that brings us back to critical thinking, which we've been talking about.
Yes.
It's about recognizing that there are rarely easy answers.
Right. There are rarely simple solutions
to complex issues like this one.
Exactly. The white paper wants us to question what we think we know, to be skeptical of simple explanations, and to think about these things in a deeper way.
And that's what we've tried to do today.
It has been a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, this deep dive has been a real journey, challenging our own assumptions.
Yeah, challenging our preconceived notions.
And helping us understand this controversial Russian law better.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to look at the connections between the law, culture, politics, and the economy.
Yeah, and it shows how those things are all connected in ways we don't always see.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
This Russian law, even though it's controversial, it gives us a chance to really think about things.
I agree.
It makes us think about how different societies deal with changing values and norms.
Right.
And it challenges us to think about these complicated issues in a more informed and productive way.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more informed, more engaged, and more committed to a world where everyone's rights are respected no matter what their culture or beliefs are.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great to unpack this complex issue and explore all the different perspectives.
Yes, it's been a great discussion.
We hope you've learned something new and that you'll keep thinking critically about this topic.
Keep learning, keep asking questions.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.